Hi, I'm Mona Band and I'm at the EWG headquarters. Today we're talking about my absolute favorite topic, and that is food. I'm here with Dr. Lexi Temkin. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you, and I'll let you introduce yourself to everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much. I can't wait to talk about all things food. I'm Dr. Lexi Temkin, Senior Toxicologist at the Environmental Working Group.
Okay, can we get into it?
Yeah.
All right, I'm excited, clearly. So I think the first thing we should open with, because I think this is what everyone knows you guys for, is EWG's Clean 15 and Dirty Dozen. I know so many people who know this list but don't even know who created it. It's just really a well-known, guide that we follow. So can you explain for anyone who doesn't know what this list means?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. So we've been doing the Clean 15 and the Dirty Dozen since I think 2004. So it's been a while now. And it's actually part of what we call the Shopper's Guide to Pesticides in Produce. And so it is exactly what you said, this guide that's supposed to help you navigate the produce aisle at the grocery store so you can get a diet that's really rich in fruits and vegetables, but low in pesticide residues.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so basically when something is on the Clean 15, it means, okay, if it's not organic, you're still better off eating this list of foods.
So the lists are the most contaminated fruits and vegetables based on pesticide residues, and then the least contaminated fruits and vegetables based on pesticide residues. And that's when they're grown through, like you said, conventional agriculture, so not organic, which doesn't allow the use of a lot of these toxic synthetic pesticides.
I have so many more questions about the list, but can we just first talk about what organic actually means? Like, are there pesticides at all? Like, are there residues?
Yeah, so the data that we use for our list generation comes from actually testing from the USDA. So they actually sample a lot of fruits and vegetables every year. We're talking hundreds of samples of these fruits and vegetables, probably thousands, and then also hundreds of different pesticide residues. And they look at both conventional and organic. And what you see is that organic residues, organic fruits and vegetables, can sometimes have synthetic pesticide residues that come from either drift, cross-contamination, things like that, but they're usually very, very low. And then there are some organic pesticides that are approved for use on organic fruits and vegetables, but they have to meet a series of standards. They're heavily reviewed by a board that looks at, do they meet all this criteria of being sort of natural, organic, not going to harm the environment or people, and they have a list of standards that they lay out.
Okay, so for people who say, like, organic doesn't even matter, they still have pesticides, the answer is not all pesticides are created equal. There's organic pesticides, non-organic, and it's really the levels.
Yeah, and one thing that we see time and time again, and this is one of the things we talk about a lot with pesticides on fruits and vegetables, is that when people actually switch to an organic diet, so there's a lot of studies that called intervention studies, they'll say, we'll give you a prescribed diet that's conventional fruits and vegetables for a couple weeks, switch to an organic diet and measure the level of exposure in people on those 2 time points. And you see that the level of pesticides rapidly drop once you switch to an organic diet.
Wow.
And so we know it's this effective tool to reduce exposure, especially to some of the really, really harmful pesticides out there.
And you're testing in their urine, their blood?
Primarily urine,
okay,
yeah.
Right. I know, I've done so many of these tests too, but I know there's different ways to do it.
Yeah, it's fast, easy, they're really good biomarkers.
Yeah, it's always just good to be aware. Mm-hmm. So for people who can't afford organic, should they strictly eat off of the Clean 15 and really just try to adhere to that? Or is it still good to get a variety? I know that's kind of a subjective question. But
yeah, so I'd say number one most important thing is get a lot of fruits and vegetables in your diet, no matter whether they're conventional or organic. We know that a lot of people don't get enough, so anything to sort of increase fruit and vegetable consumption, that's probably number one. And then depending, I think, on the foods that you really like to eat is also a good guide to go by. So the Dirty Dozen, the top things are strawberries, spinach, peaches, apples, a lot of fruits on there.
Lettuces, right? I think lettuces.
Yeah, green beans were new this most recent round that we did. So those are gonna be things that if you have the option to buy them organic, to choose an organic variety. And it doesn't have to be every time. So when we're thinking about pesticide exposure, we're often talking about, really long-term chronic exposure.
Okay.
It doesn't have to be every single time, but it's a good habit. And then the clean 15 are things like avocados, onions, asparagus, carrots, sweet potatoes. So you get both good varieties on both lists. And those are, like we said, things that when you are grown conventional are really low in residues.
Okay, that's good to know. I mean, I actually really go by your guide a lot, and I think when I'm out and I don't have access to organic food or I'm traveling, I really do try to stick to the clean 15. So I just wondered, like, again, if someone's only eating non-organic on the clean 15 all the time because they can't afford organic, it's not bad. Like, they're still better off.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I also have a question about produce spray and washing, like cleaning off pesticides. Let's really get into this. Like, I've done vinegar and water. There's some brands you can get in terms of washing them off. Like, how much are we getting off and what's the best thing to use?
Yeah, so I think the first thing, at least around this question, to talk about is that washing doesn't get rid of everything. So actually the data that we use from the USDA for our two lists are washed, peeled, they're prepared, they're designed to be prepared in the way that people would. And so the general recommendation, I know it's a thing that like doesn't come up very often, but what we're talking about are the residues that are left after usually they do sort of like a 2-minute cold water rinse. That's generally what's advised.
And I don't think people are rinsing for 2 minutes.
Probably not.
It's about 5 seconds. It's like splash.
Yeah, so washing with water for a couple minutes, I think also scrubbing and sometimes, especially for certain vegetables, and peeling are going to reduce the levels, but it doesn't get rid of everything. In terms of sort of pesticide washes or things that are commercially available, we haven't really looked at them, and a lot of them could also potentially have other toxic chemicals in them that you might want to avoid. I know there have been a couple papers that show like baking soda and water are really good on apples or something like that. So it might vary depending on the fruit, on the pesticide, but in general, like a good bet is water with like a little bit of scrubbing is going to reduce some, but not all, which is why we also recommend sort of the clean 15 or organic options.
And you say scrubbing with your hand or like getting a sponge?
I usually just do it with my hands, sort of thing. Something that's going to have like abrasion. Yeah, you'll want a clean sponge.
I usually get a big bowl and I soak them in there for like 5 minutes.
Yep.
And I'll put a little bit of vinegar. I'm like, it's just vinegar, so it can't hurt. Like white vinegar, apple cider
and that's really
vinegar.
good for like mold and bacterial contamination too, which can be an issue in some fruits and vegetables.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, obviously peeling is great, but sometimes you want the peel, right, for the benefits. Okay, that's interesting. In terms of our pesticide exposure, can we just talk about, because I also know a lot of people don't really realize the impact it makes and how negatively it can impact us, impact the environment. So can you just speak on that and why we should really try to avoid pesticides?
Yeah, for sure. So by and large, for like the general population, diet is going to be the most common way that people are exposed to pesticides. There's also, for farm worker populations, people that are actually working in agriculture, the harm from pesticide use and spraying and things like that is going to also be a lot larger, and you can see really severe health effects. And so that's something to also consider, not just your personal exposure, but when you're thinking about pesticides and organic foods, how this is impacting the broader environment and other people. So, we've seen that some pesticides are linked to neurodevelopmental harm in children. The EPA just passed basically a ban on a pesticide called chlorpyrifos, which had been allowed on fruits and vegetables for a long time. It was also used as like repellents in homes. And the EPA just kind of ignored science for a really long time and kept allowing the use of this really harmful pesticide that studies on people had shown over and over again these levels are not safe and are really harming children's development. So that's
children with pregnant mothers who are using them, or actual children, like
both. So there were associations with pregnant people who were exposed during development, and then also like children who were exposed in early life and seeing developmental delays sort of later on and neurodevelopmental harm. So that was something we'd been seeing where EPA tends to allow a lot of pesticides to stay in use, even as the data is sort of mounting up to show that they're potentially harmful. So it kind of comes back to this legal doesn't always mean safe thing that we talk a lot about. In terms of dietary pesticides, we've seen associations with impacts on fertility, cancer risk, cardiovascular disease. There was this fascinating study that showed eating fruits and vegetables, could lower your risk of cardiovascular disease. That's one of these great reasons for fruits and vegetables. But if you ate fruits and vegetables that had higher pesticide residues, that protective effect was diminished. So, and these are things that aren't just often considered in regulatory agencies. So it's one of the reasons why we focus on a lot of our efforts on how to reduce your overall exposure.
This is kind of a this or that question. So it's almost like, is it better to eat organic frozen fruit or fresh non-organic fruit?
Oh, that's a really good question. So I think we would also say it's good to eat frozen fruit if that's your only option, and your other option is processed foods or not a fruit or vegetables sort of thing. So probably our recommendation is usually if it's on the Clean 15 or the Dirty Dozen, try to get it organic also in the frozen variety.
Right.
I don't know if that sort of answers your question, but fresh fruit is, best, frozen is better or second, but always better than a processed food.
Right. Yeah, I was always wondering too. I remember one time I was, I think, traveling, and I'm like, okay, I can either get this orange and banana that are not organic, or I can get this snack bar that is organic, but this is processed.
Yeah.
And then it gets into a funny game where you're like, what's the better choice? So I don't know, maybe just always going organic, or do you think unprocessed?
I think I might opt for the fresh fruit or vegetable, or fresh fruit. I think also a lot of times the bars and things can have, hidden sugars and just be really high in sugar.
It's true.
Things like that. And you can get sort of the fiber from the fruits and things like that. So I think I would opt for whole fruit.
I do think it's nice because sometimes it's discouraging for people when they're like, if I can't afford organic, am I doing something bad? And no one wants to feel like they're making the wrong choices. So it's you do the best you can. This is the best option if it's not accessible to you. Also, sometimes things just aren't even in season.
Yeah.
Right, what about how do you guys measure and figure out the chemicals that are added to food and how that gets regulated and what the labels mean? When you go to the grocery store, I think I learned that the word natural actually has no legal ramification behind it. It can be anything that comes, if I remember correctly, anything that comes from the earth or animal or anything. I don't know.
Yeah, I honestly...
It's broad, I remember.
It's super broad, and there's not a lot of sort of validation or certification behind it. So at least in terms of processed food, there are a lot of food additives that can be added to foods. USDA organic is not gonna have those synthetic foods allowed or synthetic additives allowed. And one of the reasons we're concerned about a lot of the food additives is because of the way they're regulated, which is very little regulation at all. So the FDA approves food additives, but they really don't have a thorough safety review, and there's no process to sort of re-review chemicals as more science comes to show, hey, those might actually be harmful. Yeah, so that was one of the reasons why EWG sponsored a bill in the California legislature earlier this year it was the first bill to ban certain food chemicals from being used in foods. And it was 4 chemicals, red dye number 3, brominated vegetable, oil, potassium bromate, and propylparaben.
So this was the first time there's been a bill passed to ban certain chemicals in food?
Yeah, I think at the state level, and these are also all chemicals that have already been not approved for use in the European Union. So they've sort of been out of foods in other countries and indicated for their harm in other countries for a while before.
So it's interesting because the FDA can approve a chemical without really much information and just saying that it's safe, even though we don't know. And then there's also nothing in place in terms of, right, let's challenge it. They really don't have to. You just have to keep pushing and pushing for them to challenge it, to maybe make it illegal, like what you're doing now in California.
Yeah, and so there had been petitions basically to get the FDA to kind of look at these chemicals again, especially red dye number 3, which, their own data, it was like in the 90s, they indicated it was potentially carcinogenic, but there just was no follow through on the legislation. And so by focusing on bills in a state like California, where it can sort of pass through the legislature, and it's such a big state that companies will likely follow, and it can actually impact sort of the rest of the population.
Okay.
When we don't see the FDA
Okay.
taking action.
So I'm curious why California. Is it because they're more open to it? Like, are you working with other states? Is that just the first one you've started with?
I think mostly it's just that California, because it's such a big state, like there's going to be sort of follow through with the way that impacts the rest of the US. And they have just a really progressive legislature in the sense that a lot of bills can get passed there.
Okay.
New York is another state that's working on a food bill and some of the other bills that we have been working on.
Okay. So interesting, because I have seen food products that are organic but still have a lot of chemicals. So when you're saying that USDA organic, it bans certain chemicals but not all, right?
Yeah, so it's very similar to that organic pesticide process. Is they have to meet certain standards that are set out by basically like the Organic National Standards Review Board, to meet different standards that are largely based around no harm to the environment and no harm to human health.
Okay. What other labels, when people are at the grocery store, should they look out for? I mean, we know we can trust USDA organic.
Yeah.
There are some other organic labels that aren't USDA organic. Do you know much on those?
So at least for where there are a lot of labels that I see is in meat and dairy products. And we went through, basically combed through a lot of those labels to understand what they mean and came up with essentially a label decoder. And that can help people basically find the ones that are more reliable and the ones that are less reliable, especially in this area where it comes to antibiotic use, hormone use, treatment of animals.
Yeah. I feel like it gets confusing because you see everything. You're like, humanely treated, great. And then you're like antibiotic, hormone, but does that mean organic?
Yeah, and some are far more reliable than others.
Okay.
And some actually have, third-party certifications. Others don't. Some actually have audits and reviews. Others don't. So there's a lot of them to go through, but we have our label decoder there for at least a lot of those meat and dairy products.
So EWG has a resource for this where you can go decode all the labels.
Yeah.
Okay.
EWG's, I think it's meat and dairy label decoder.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay.
Yeah.
And maybe just explain to everyone what third-party testing means. I know some people have asked me on that, like why that's important.
Yeah, it's essentially just a way to verify that standards are met. So a lot of people or companies can sort of claim certain things, but if you don't have another certifier or just third party backing that up, then there's not a lot of just sort of validity in that.
Right, because it could be like, our internal team said it was safe, and we're like, okay, we need someone third party to come in and give us that okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and so that's what, EWG has adopted in some of our like personal care products and things like that, this verification system where we have a standard, and once you meet that, you know that this, that, and the other thing have been sort of achieved, and it's better for health and the environment.
Okay. The Red 40 you said is one of the ones that was just banned?
Red 3.
Red 3. So there's so many, I always just thought when I see the colors, avoid them. Is that kind of is that a general rule of thumb, dyes because they're artificial anyway?
Yeah, so some food dyes in particular, Red 3 was one of them, but there are others on the list. In particular, were linked to increased hyperactivity in children. Okay. And so that's one of the reasons why avoiding some of those colorants and food additives would be a really good idea. Red 3 in particular had also been linked to cancer risk. So it was something that really should have been out of food for a while.
Wow.
Yeah.
Why do you think people don't want to accept these things? I feel like when we share this information, a lot of times people get defensive and don't believe it. Like, it's interesting, right?
Yeah, I think there's just general assumption that things are regulated and things are safe, and that kind of government and all those agencies are doing their jobs. or that those standards are high enough, So, and that's just not necessarily the case. And so that's why we try to take the best science that's out there, that's coming from epidemiological studies where you're actually looking at exposures in humans and associated health effects, and incorporating that into guides, and saying that just because it meets a government standard or is legal doesn't necessarily mean it's fully protective of your health. But I think there's this assumption that that's the case, which makes a lot of sense because it should be that way.
Yeah, and I guess it's challenging people to work a little harder or maybe put a little more effort, and sometimes they don't want to because it is the harder way. Maybe it just gets hard.
Yeah, and it can be overwhelming, and I think, at least like EWG's approach is to often tackle these things from a consumer sort of choice perspective as well as market change, like trying to get companies to push in the right direction, and then also trying to get legislation to sort of do the right thing to push. So it's kind of it's a multi-pronged approach.
And one question, what's on your priority list? How do you know what chemical to investigate? Are you looking at something that's used in a lot of foods?
Yeah.
How is it brought to your attention?
I would say, so at least with this food chemical ban bill in California, we also relied on legislation and regulation in other countries. So places where the safety standard might be a little bit higher and there's data to indicate that there's harm, and already regulations that are prohibiting those things. So we just see stronger standards in other places like Europe, and then also just sort of what the science shows, if there's just mounting evidence on something that exposure to this is not going to be good to your health, then it's something that we want to figure out how to avoid.
That's true. You're actually, a lot of the data has been there and we're just ignoring it. So you're seeing, okay, what do we know is really showing up as unsafe for us, and then challenging getting it either restricted or illegal.
There's just a lot of great data out there. And so it's trying to assess that for safety and what it means for people's exposure and their health, and targeting those chemicals that have really strong evidence.
And when it comes to animal products, I'm just curious, is there any regulation? I know we talked about that. Is this also in your label decoder of I know grass-fed and finished is really important for red meat or pasture-raised, let's say, but does organic mean anything in terms of is there something people can at least aim for when they're buying animal protein?
Yeah, I think the strongest one is probably USDA organic, but again, there's kind of these most reliable and least reliable that hit different things.
Okay.
But it's primarily focused on antibiotic use, hormone use, and how the animal's sort of treated.
Okay. I also remember learning, correct me if I'm wrong, with pesticides when they first were created, were marketed as an antibiotic for humans and then switched over to pesticides. And I don't know if there's truth in that, but wondering if, obviously we all want to limit our antibiotic exposure. So just curious if they affect us in the same way in terms of harming our body.
That's probably one example of a pesticide. I can't think of the one off the top of my head, but I guess what we sort of know, at least with pesticides, is that they are inherently designed to be toxic and harmful, whether that's for an insect or a weed or a fungus. And what we often see is that there are these off-target effects in things like mammals, like humans, or other species that are similar, like pollinators and things like that. So you have just sort of unintended effects that might be similar to how the pesticide is designed to work.
Yep. That answers a lot. And I feel like just as a general piece of advice for everyone, I think the world of food is so big and there's so many areas we could start in. Is your one piece of advice of somewhere they can start to avoid pesticides, or is there something else? What could people do?
Okay, so I would say number one thing is probably just trying to increase more fresh and whole foods into your diet and less packaged and processed foods. If you already eat a lot of fruits and vegetables, choosing items on the Dirty Dozen organic and then conventional Clean 15 is a good way to help get more fruits and vegetables while reducing pesticide exposure. And then we also have EWG food scores to help people navigate through packaged foods when you think about sugar content, nutritional profile, food additives. We've done a lot of that work to help rate products, as healthier or things to avoid.
Oh, that's great. I didn't know about that one.
Yeah,
okay.
But definitely more whole foods, less processed and packaged, and then once you do that, there's some other places to start.
I always say, like, that's never, you know how it's like sometimes it's like saturated fat is bad, now it's good, and stevia is great. Okay, now we're not sure about stevia. Like, the one thing we could never go back on is that whole foods are good. Doesn't matter what your macronutrient preference is. If you want to be paleo or keto or vegan, like if you're eating whole foods, you really can't go as wrong.
Yeah, that's, I think, definitely where we see in terms of studies that are linking diet to better health effects is increasing just the amount of sort of fresh, unprocessed foods.
Honestly, thank you for the work you do, because it makes our lives so much easier, and it's real scientific work. You guys have a team of experts here. You know, I think you're not just researching online, you're actually doing the research. So I think everybody appreciates it because we need this information.
Yeah, it's super important, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I loved this conversation, and as you learn more info, we would love to keep talking about it because there's always new things to know and learn.
For sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.